Alternative Reality, Volume 1, Chapter 9. A goblin crumbled to the ground in a bloody mess, releasing a last gurgle as Bob cut down the poor, unpleasant-to-look-at creature. A similar fate awaited a few others, as the other bandits did their job. Whale wasn't exactly sitting on his hands either, as he threw fireball after fireball at the first few glimpses of the approaching monster tide. And quite the tide it was, for the narrow corridor vibrated from the cacophony of sounds and scrambling feet, while the darkness beyond the torchlight seemed to churn like a stormy sea. A disheartening sight, without a doubt. Which is why no one was bent on staying and waiting. The group quickly continued their retreat in a hasty, though somewhat bloody flight. With teeth clenched tight, Whale stared at the ever-approaching staircase that so recently served as nothing more than a nerve-wracking headache, yet now shined like a beacon of hope. A gateway to a profitable future. Being the ingenious and utterly sadistic mastermind that Whale was, he had come up with a wacky idea to abuse the mindless momentum of the approaching tide. If their group managed to make it back up the flight of stairs and around the corner, they'd be able to use the goblin tide's mindless charge against them. Nobody, and Whale knew this from childhood experiences, knew how to properly turn a corner at full sprint. What always awaited was a painful smack and a tumble, magnified exponentially when applied to a churning tide of berserk goblins. Whale rubbed at his jaw as his memories pulled him way back into a distant past, where his childish delusions of being able to do anything were first shattered, along with a few molars. And what do you do when a kid makes a painful mistake and is down on the ground flailing? Whale's lips twisted into a wicked grin. Why, you make sure the lesson sticks with some physical reinforcement. These goblins were about to learn the lesson the hard way. Easier said than done, of course, since their stamina was critically low by the time the group finally got to the stairs, every single member panting like they just ran a marathon. Which they sorta did. Yet it was too soon to rest, unless they were planning for a permanent one. By the look of how desperately the group scrambled up the stairs, kicking, shoving, and swearing at each other like rabid animals, seems like none were interested in giving up. They scampered up the narrow stairway and slipped around the corner, finally reaching their destination. Here's good, Whale heaved, feeling as if his heart was about to jump out of his ribcage. Relief washed over him at managing up to this point. Yet just as relief came, so did that rush of adrenaline that kept him going up to now started to drain away. Awareness of just how exhausted he was feeling becoming soon apparent. As if that wasn't enough, Whale could even feel doubt start creeping in, eating away at his confidence. What if this little trick wouldn't work, after all? What if the narrow ascent and the turn of the corner wouldn't be enough to completely obliterate their momentum? Surely no creature could be stupid enough to fall for a trick as simple as this. Well, he was giving the goblins more credit than they were due. Their tide struck the corner like an earthquake. The thud of their bodies against the wall was an eerie drumming in their heads that deafened. So loud it was that Whale couldn't even hear himself doubt nor think. Just as he had hoped, the stampede would not stop, could not stop even if it wanted to, as those ahead were pushed and shoved ahead in a tumble of limbs until they were squished against the corner. It was utter chaos. It was carnage. There was no way Whale or the bandits, as numbed by the noise and sight as they were, would miss out on this opportunity, however. Having retreated a tad to avoid being drowned out by the amassing horde, the group took position higher up the stairs, weapons at the ready as they watched until the goblin mass seemed to create a big enough congestion that it was no longer expanding towards them. Before them was a squirming, hissing mass of limbs and claw, the goblins so compressed that they practically formed a single entity. Truly an unpleasant sight. But potential profits always won out, no matter the disgust. If you knew that there was gold buried deep in shit, wouldn't you try to dig it out? Neither one of Whale's group seemed averse to the idea, and with blades flashing, they finally got to work with teeth-clenched grunts. It didn't take long, however, for good old-fashioned hack and slash to come short, with more dead goblins in reach than living ones. Not to mention that it was getting damned hard to get any further through all the bodies. Thus, Whale had no choice but to simplify the process, somewhat. Licking his lips, he started charging up his new favorite spell, and just before finishing, shouted for his bandit colleagues to get back. Sheesh, it was almost as if he wanted them to get caught in the inferno. Suddenly, the corridor below erupted into bright dancing flames, the bandits jumping back with angry snarls as the fiery tongues licked at their heels. Whale grinned. He was probably the first to create a goblin barbecue on this scale, and couldn't help but be beside himself with joy. That lasted until the smell reached him, and the whole group were bent over dry heaving a moment later. You have gained a level. 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 An endless stream of experience started flowing in, triggering numerous level-up notifications. Whale was trembling, sweating, grinning like a madman. It was a surprise his sweaty palms didn't extinguish the fireballs he kept on conjuring whenever able. This was worth the 1 hour or whatever walk, worth all the nerve-wracking waiting, all the bad that happened to him while leveling up in the village. This was Whale's moment of triumph. His companions weren't complaining either, as they hacked away all their stamina on the poor, misguided little creatures. Though they didn't exactly have much of a choice in it. Simply put, it was do or die. Time went by quickly, and before they knew it, 20 minutes were already out the window. Though Whale was so preoccupied with grinding out levels that it might as well have been a mere moment. If only it could have lasted forever. Together with his mana supply, that is. Sadly, the goblin morale finally crumbled, though it was quite surprising it lasted this long. Their bloodlust must have negated the morale effect, for a time. But when all you can attack is a wall that you slam face forward into, not much drive to continue remains. Thus, the remaining goblins scattered, leaving a corridor full of charred meat and a large pile of hacked body parts near the foot of the stairs. That and the utterly disgusting stench in the air, it was surprising the group could even stay upright against it. Due to overcoming a challenge, +1 leadership, +20 fame, +1 intellect. -60 reputation for exploiting and torturing creatures of lesser intellect. No matter where he was, reality just had a way of letting Whale know how it disagreed with his resourceful methods. Poor underappreciated Whale. For a time, the grotesque scene would remain like so, but only until the monsters are reborn, or in in-game terms, until the monsters respawn. Once so, the body parts will scatter into 1,000 particles, disappearing like they were never there to begin with. Unrealistic? Sure, But if such a system wouldn't be implemented, dungeons that are shared instances would become a one-time adventure. Only those who are first would enjoy its glory, leaving everyone else to search for other prey, until nothing remained for there to hunt down. No new adventures to discover, only empty fields and empty barren halls filled with the bones of those deceased. How much of a competitive environment would that have created? Fueled by a desperation to get a piece of the fun, people would have been driven into a frenzy. Seems like the game developers had no intention of creating that sort of unhealthy environment that relied solely on interplayer competition. Of course, it's not like Whale thought that the developers were angels or anything of the sort. They probably just wanted to prioritize accessibility so that as many people would be stuck in this damn game for as long as possible. And as for the disappearing carcasses, if the monsters respawn after certain time intervals that are regulated by the developers, corpses of the slain become an issue. What happens if players keep on slaughtering monsters in the same spot? Their dead bodies accumulate and pile up. Instead of mountains, adventurers would brave huge piles of the dead. The mountaineer profession would find a whole new meaning. Corpseineer? Or maybe the undertaker or the graveyard keeper professions would see a renaissance of some sort. Whale shook himself out of the mental pitfall, confident that making the bodies eventually disappear was the right call, and probably only added to the success of alternative reality. A perfect world for everyone to participate in. A perfect world to spend a whole weekend on. Drawn back to the matter at hand, Whale looked over the aftermath. Smoking piles of goo, ashes and charred bodies. Contrary to the grotesque view, the mad magician couldn't help but grin. He managed to raise his level by 20 from just one encounter. It was a glorious feeling and seemed to just be the beginning. The very beginning of this dungeon. Who knows what wonders awaited deeper? First things first, of course, the loot. What wondrous items will the dungeon bonus bring? What rare loot will he get his hands on? Oh, the suspense! Whale could hardly contain himself. Wherever his sharp, greedy gaze moved, coins glittered everywhere. So much profit! A few steps forward, to the left, bend, and bingo! Whale grabbed a weapon handle and pulled, only to reveal a heavily damaged and half-melted sword. Upon closer inspection, common steel sword. Description: a sword carried around by a goblin reaver, probably taken from a dead adventurer. Its quality is poor, but it served well as a mass-produced weapon for military use. Durability: 2 out of 50. Damage: from 14 to 35. Weapon class: longsword. Requirements: level 42, strength 50. The sword is so heavily damaged, might as well just melt it down and make a new one. An unpleasant premonition, like the threat of an oncoming sneeze, rose somewhere in the back of Whale's mind. He quickly shrugged it off and bent to the right, picking up another item. A charred leather armor. Or what remained of it. Military-grade leather armor. Description: leather armor worn by Onion reconnaissance troops during the 10-Year War. Probably scavenged from dead bodies. Poor quality due to age. Durability: 1 out of 30. Defense: 25. Armor class: light. Requirements: level 35, 30 agility. The armor is heavily damaged, impossible to repair, maybe you could use it to make a scarecrow? Whale's eyebrow twitched. Wherever he looked, only ruin of loot remained. His reckless use of fire ruined everything. Dreams of wealth, better equipment, shattered. Or burned up, to be precise. Until now, Whale never had problems with burned items to this extent. Usually, fires caused by the fireball spell were out once the target died. With Inferno, he never really checked, since it was mostly used on large groups of critters, who seemed to drop body parts and pocket money. Why the bodily parts would end up somewhat overcooked made all the sense in the world now. He did not expect such an outcome at all. Quite the blunder. He should have, but didn't. Adrenaline and excitement clouded his judgment, obscured his meticulous insight. Whale felt a shattering loss. So many useful and possibly profitable opportunities, all burned to ashes due to his sadistic nature, due to his flawed judgment. Regret washed over Whale like a current, dragging him down into a whirlpool of thoughts, pulling him away from the goings-on around him. If not for Bob and his brethren in crime, who knows how long he'd be stuck there, lost in a daze. Maybe poked and made fun of by some passerby even. Ugh, truly horrible. While Whale was busy wallowing in self-pity, the bandits started gathering what remained of the loot. Without any complaints, they scavenged for broken down items, coins, and anything else of value. Right under Whale's nose. And that's exactly what brought him back. Noise caused by the clatter of money and gear. By the rummaging bandits. Sounds of profit being lost. Seems like even though greed was what made him stumble, it was also what made him rise once again. Anger flashed, and Whale was moments away from scorching his colleagues for such betrayal when he was at his weakest. Yet with a shudder he managed to control himself, this time. Instead, he sprang to action, driven by his bottomless greed and bitter feelings towards the world. Whale flew around like a tornado, grabbing every single coin his sharp eyes could pinpoint, scrawny clawed hands shooting out like bullets. None of it took long, and the end result was 45 gold, 2,659 silver, and 1,423 copper coins. A quality haul. Not to mention an unexpected stroke of luck. Whale managed to find 2 undamaged rings and a strange tome. Since he could wear any number of rings, as long as they fit on his fingers, Whale instantly put them on. One of them was mainly for fighters, with endurance, strength, and damage reduction bonuses. Wisdom and mana regeneration was given by the other one. Since he didn't have any rings until now, both were a welcome presence. Why would he even consider sharing? It's not like he could have managed any of this on his own, without the support of his bandit colleagues. Truly, it was all him. What a bastard. Curious, Whale tried to figure out what the tome was for and how it survived his reckless use of fire. But seeing it somehow resist identification attempts, the intent was put aside for now. Skeptical, Whale couldn't help but give the thing a once-over, eyes narrowed with interest. What a peculiar item indeed. Its dark leather covers decorated with morbid symbols of skulls and whatnot. Indistinguishable writing scattered about like doodles done by a 5-year-old. Heck, it even glowed in the dark, a little bit. Whale had an inkling feeling that the book was made by some fellow in his emo phase, only to be discarded after she grew out of it. Totally not because Whale could relate to it from personal experience. Either way, the unapologetic hoarder of a mage decided to hold on to it, against the better judgment of any sane mind, grubby fingers quickly shoving the book away in a spacious bag of loot. Containers were an interesting feature inside alternative reality. They had various shapes and numerous types, but all of them shared a common feature. They grew in size. Each container used by adventurers had varied space inside, but the main feature was that each one was significantly larger than what you'd expect from first glance. Compensating for this unrealistic feature, they tended to grow in size once certain weight thresholds were reached. Though the growth obviously had a limit. Quite often, the items inside might be larger than the bag itself, with the bag being large enough to be able to actually take those things out when needed. Whale's own container was in the form of a comfy satchel. Once he placed the tome inside, which was almost as big as the satchel itself, the container visibly grew in size, though it still wasn't exactly as big as the book itself. Really, this was the real mind-boggling magic. All that conjured fire paled in comparison. Currency had a separate container type and didn't mix with the other items, but it functioned in an identical manner. It enlarged like it was made out of rubber, depending on the amount of currency inside. It also had an additional function, currency exchange. One can only imagine how big the bag should be to carry around thousands of various coins. Thus, the currency placed inside was automatically converted from smaller to bigger denominations. 1 gold coin was equal to 100 silver coins, and 1 silver coin to 100 copper coins. Result? Whale currently had 72 gold coins, 73 silver, and 23 copper. If the player wanted to turn his wealth into smaller currency, he needed to enable a special game menu while accessing the content of his bag. Some thought of this system as cumbersome, but no one really wanted to drag around a huge bag of coins, constantly getting in the way. That want for things to be realistic could never ever contend with the need for convenience. Of course, the currency exchange function only served as a temporary solution for mostly small-time players. Some players would end up acquiring thousands of gold coins, if not hundreds of thousands. To help them, there was a large chain of banks responsible for the safekeeping of players' owned wealth. Banks were a completely safe institution accessible from almost every larger town. One only needed to visit the bank for your wealth to reach safety. Whale sneered. What a bunch of propaganda. The idea was totally not sponsored by some bigger banks in real life during game development. As an alternative, however, for players who chose a different path in-game, for one reason or another, an additional option was implemented. Trying to avoid inserting too many of their own morals into the game, the developers implemented a personal banking system of sorts, for those outside of legal bounds, so to speak. Players were able to place their wealth in a virtual vault of sorts. It had unlimited storage space, but only accepted currency. Not only that, but wealth could be withdrawn only every 10 in-game days. Only while outside combat as well. The same rule set applied to storing your money in there. A complicated feature, rarely preferred by most individuals. It was there though. Thus players' wealth was safe to a certain degree. It was up to the players whether they used it or not. Eyeing the bandits and considering his ever deeper move into the negative reputation territory, something told Whale that he would eventually need to rely heavily on that system, whether he wanted to or not.